Hi, Greg.
Hello, Hugh.
Today is the 27th. It's a full moon. The moon's in Gemini, and by the time we finish with this video, it'll be in Cancer. And I'm a Cancer. I'm a child of the moon. Uh, this is the best time of the year for me when there's a full moon. And there's only 27 days left till Christmas. So today's the 27th, and there's 27 days left until Christmas.
Very good.
Tonight, I'm going to talk about a whole bunch of things. I'm going to talk about a drug trade, about the people that murdered Hoffa, um, about Kennedy's Vice President Johnson in my family, and about the family that took my baby pictures. My baby pictures were taken on September 11th, 1953. And you've seen copies of those.
Yeah, by
And
George Towers.
yeah, they were taken by the Towers family for Eastman-Kodak, and there's patents on my baby pictures from Kodak. And then where my wives were murdered on the Manning Ranch, Kodak lived next door to me. And that's not coincidence. And that's the same family that tried to get Trump to steal the White House. And I wanted to talk about exposing Trump for a little bit.
Well, that definitely needs to be done.
Everybody that put him in the White House are the families that kidnapped me and murdered my 4-year-old twin on the day Admiral Byrd was murdered. And then Mr. Pratt cut my father's hands off on that day before I was kidnapped by Governor Osbourne's family in Long and Wallace.
Mm-hmm.
And Osbourne put Trump in the White House with Stone.
Right.
Stone was running a hospital in Warren, Michigan, and he illegally cut the bone out of my foot as torture as John F. Kennedy was killed. And these things aren't coincidence. Stone and Osborne and Miller and several other people in Trump's campaign who put him in the White House are the families that kidnapped me at 4, tortured and raped me. They would make me get on my knees, and then they would hit me with 2x4s across my thighs and make me have sex with them while chained to a toilet. And they murdered my twin there. And my twin was brought back from California with Camille Sirhan,
Mm-hmm.
Sirhan's family. And this was 1957. This was 11 years before they framed Sirhan for killing Bobby Kennedy. I've never believed that story. As my cousin, who was born on the same day as me, July 4th, married Camille Sirhan, they framed Sirhan for Bobby's murder.
Yeah, that's just amazing. Yeah.
No, and then when you look at the fact that the Baker family worked with my family at Chrysler on 9 Mile and Mound, and that's Judith Baker's family. And then Judith Baker has lived with the Osborne family that kidnapped me when I was 4 and murdered my twin her entire life.
Yeah, amazing how she likes to defend pedophiles. I've noticed in her books. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's she married into my family. I'm the Baker family. Marilyn Monroe, her real name is Baker. That's my cousin. And Gardner family, like Marguerite Gardner and Ava Gardner, that's my family. And their mother was Baker.
Mm-hmm.
And Judith Baker claims she doesn't know me, but I don't believe most things she says. Simply because she's lived with the pedophiles that murdered my twin for over 60 years now.
Yeah.
I don't, when she calls me on the phone, I don't believe what she tells me. And I don't care what she has to think about that. I really don't care. Everybody in Trump's campaign, Stone illegally cut the bone out of my foot, running a hospital on the day Kennedy was murdered. And Stone had no medical training whatsoever. He tortured me, and to this day, the foot that he cut the bone out of is always numb. I have a hard time walking on it. And if I use it too much, it hurts like all hell.
I can imagine that
When
would
I
be.
when I went back and I was sitting in Al Brooks Patterson's office, and they murdered 5 more of my kids. They murdered my brother-in-law's kid, Tony Jr., my bass player kids, de Blasio, his son, Tony Jr., and my daughter with Karen, Serena, my first murdered wife. They murdered her Christmas Day after raping her. They chained her to a tree, kicked her teeth out, kicked her in the stomach so much it destroyed her appendix. She had to have an appendectomy after the rape. And we were going to get married, and she was raped again by my own brother in front of our kids. So we chose not to get married and went our separate ways. And then she was murdered Christmas Day. And when I sat in Al Brooks Patterson's office trying to make police reports out about Osbourne and Long and Wallace at my public school, which the FBI was funding. The FBI funded my school system. Those 5 kids were murdered. Two more of my family members were murdered in Indiana, where the 9/11 Truthers site is. And that woman, Pam Brandenburg, was supposed to put me on her 9/11 site, but she never did.
Right.
Her father was a gay man and used to rape her brother. And her brother turned gay. Talked her out of putting me on the 9/11 Truther site. And she had put up donations for me to turn into real Oakland County child killings. She told me I didn't get any money, but then I noticed after I left her home, she bought a brand new house for herself.
Yeah.
I don't believe anything anybody tells me anymore. And when I was a little kid, my 2 wives that were murdered on the Manning Ranch, after I escaped Osbourne and Wallace and Long and Anderson and Andrews, and back then Judge Andrews had a TV series like Judge Judy on, I think it was called Night Court, and it was in the Detroit area, and I believe CBS ran it. That Judge Andrews, him and Anderson and Wallace and Long and Osbourne, who were governors. Osbourne was the governor of Michigan, who always ran against my family. And then Pratt cut my dad's hands off, and the Twin Towers were built on Pratt Street 30 years later.
Yeah, that's no way that's coincidence, right?
And then my baby pictures were taken on 9/11, 1953. So I know they planned the Twin Towers.
Yeah, by George Towers, George Bush and the Twin Towers.
Yeah, and then it's on the Road in Detroit is where Mr. Towers took the pictures for Eastman-Kodak. And then Eastman lived next door to me as they murdered 2 of my wives. That's Eastman-Kodak's offices in Greenville, Tennessee. And in Greenville, Tennessee, that's where George Bush was making Hitler's uniforms and parachutes throughout World War II for Hitler's army. And the whole town of Greenville helped the Bush family do that.
Yeah, Eastman. Yeah, Eastman. Trump's friend too. Yeah.
They made munitions there, and George Bush made cyanide for the mints down where Trump lives now, near Mar-a-Lago. And Bush sold cyanide to leaders like Saddam Hussein. And Saddam Hussein in the United Nations was saying the truth. He said he destroyed all the cyanide he bought from George Bush. They never found any cyanide because he was telling the United Nations the truth. If you remember.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Then my girlfriend put George Bush in the kindergarten class as I was online with her and the Voss family, who he said trained the non-existent Muslims on 9/11. And I was talking to the Voss family, Debbie Voss, on a chat called Eyeballs Chat back then with the girl that put him in that kindergarten class as my Uncle Mills filmed him. And then he said my name in a Freudian slip. And you're aware of all of this.
Yeah, we have that video on our playlist here on our YouTube
I said a whole lot I really didn't want to go into, but all of that fits together. And it's real important that the people watching this video realize that Stone and Osbourne kidnapped me at 4 and were the real Oakland County child killers. And Elbrooks Patterson was sitting out in the driveway as they raped me and murdered my twin.
Okay.
With Wallace and Long. And it's real important that people realize this is who Trump is. And then when I stopped that illegal Senate gun and drug trade on the property I bought in Utica, Michigan, that was 7 square mile farm. And I bought that from Trump's tax attorney, Mazzar. And as I bought that from Mazzar tried to get me to buy a hooker for him and a judge in Utica, Michigan. And I told him no. These are who these people are who are putting Trump in the White House. And there's no lie in this.
Right.
So the drug trade was sold to me, the illegal Senate gun and drug trade was sold to me via Trump's tax attorney. And a Mr. Giles. I want to go back. That was a drug trade sold to me by Trump, but back when Kennedy was murdered, and people don't know it, Donald Trump is 21 or 22 years older than me. All right. And
well, he'd be about, I think he's 81 now, isn't he? So he'd be 11 years older than you?
Yeah, he's 11 or 12 years older than me.
Yeah.
And when I was 10, and that would make Trump, that's his real name, Trump, not Trump.
Right, the German name.
Yeah. Trump. He changed Trump to Trump so he could build his towers and act like he was Trump in a deck of cards. And this is all BS. Just like Stone and Osbourne kidnapped me and murdered my twin in 57, as Pratt cut my father's hands off and they murdered my uncle Admiral Byrd. And all of this was done by the people who put Donald Trump in the White House. That's the same families.
Yeah.
And that Osbourne family runs the sex crime division in California right now.
Yeah, and as Trump's campaign manager. So these, I mean, they're totally are guarding him.
Yeah. You understand what's really going on. And I really understand. They murdered my twin. These people have murdered my entire family 5 times. And I say entire family, that includes the children in my families. And they've done this 5 times since I was born.
Mm-hmm.
They murdered my mother's family at church.
Yeah, it was a semi truck, right?
Mrs. Fuller and her brother. And that's why I know Kamala Harris isn't my family, because the only brother my mother had was murdered when he was 12. He didn't have any kids. And my grandfather, his wife was murdered at church, and he didn't have no more kids. And I know this because I grew up with them. Now back in '63, the week they murdered Kennedy, my father stopped an illegal gun and drug trade. And the reason he stopped it was that it was a bunch of swingers. I bought him and my mother a house in Sterling Township. It wasn't a city yet. It was called Sterling Township. Today it's called Sterling Heights. It's a city now. In '63, when they murdered Kennedy, he stopped this gun and drug trade run by Martin. And you have Mary Martin was Peter Pan, and Brown. And Martin and Brown are my mother's cousins, and they lived across the street from the house I bought for my family. And I could buy that house because I had a band, and my band practiced there, and I made all the payments. And then my mother's sisters were stealing my inheritance from my grandfather and buying themselves houses and cars and going to Vegas and spending 100 grand at a time. I mean, that was who my aunts were, my mother's sisters. And I know this is a fact because my mother told me this about 4 hours before she was murdered.
Mm.
She said, I know my sisters and my first son, who isn't my brother, he's my half brother from another father. She says, I know my firstborn son and my sister stole your inheritance from my father. And she says, so I'm going to leave you my inheritance. And she went in the house, and it was midnight, and there was nobody there. The only person in that house is my little brother David. And David was dressed up as they stole my business, Bottomline, and gave the world David Letterman. He was dressed up in my uniform for Bottomline after they stole my Bottomline trademark. And my mother and father, all my brothers and sisters and all my friends helped him do that. And they even took a picture of it. And the reason they did that is because I divorced my wife, Nancy. But I didn't tell them that Nancy come up behind me with a butcher knife and stabbed me and pushed me down 2 flights of stairs trying to murder me. And that was a year after I walked in on her having sex in front of my kids with a homicide detective that was supposed to be protecting me from Nichols and Procus, who had they had drugged me to the point of I died and left me in a tub of ice water and stole my car. And then they drove to an airport and stole an airplane. And that homicide detective my new wife was sleeping with was supposed to be protecting me. Instead, I came home from work and he was having sex with my wife in front of my kids, eating dinner in the kitchen. And then she built this story up in her head that I was cheating on her, and I wasn't. And that detective was one of my best friends.
Yeah.
So my best friends in my band, my best friend who was a detective, and then my best friend when I escaped Osbourne and Hall and Wallace and Long, governors, who were torturing me by hitting my thighs with a 2x4 and then making me have sex with them. I lost my train of thought.
Well, you got a little distracted earlier about you were
Well,
going to mention
I
that.
was put on an Indian reservation by the chief of the Blackfoot. His name was Redbird. And I stayed there for a summer until school started. Then I went back to school. And I want to apologize for coughing. I have COVID again.
Yeah.
And I didn't shave today. I don't know if you can tell. I'm really sick. If I start coughing and hacking, it's because of the COVID.
I know you'd mentioned your brother David there was with your mom the night that she
he was
died.
the
You were
only
about to say
person.
that she
He
died
was
that
the
night.
only person with my mother, and he was the executor of her will. And my father had left him the house I bought for my mother and father and family with my band and my inheritance. And that was just a small part of my inheritance. The house cost in 61 when I bought it for him, it only cost 15 grand for a tri-level house. I mean, houses were cheaper than they are now. And nowadays that house would sell for 250,000. But I bought them that house, and then my father left it to my youngest brother, and my youngest brother and mother and father and all my friends and my other younger brother and every relative I know stole my business, Bottomline, as I became a publisher. I was going to publish all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll get into that in a little bit. But on the day they murdered Kennedy, the week before, my father stopped the Martin family and the Brown family from selling drugs. And their entire car was full of drugs.
Yeah.
It was full of marijuana and heroin and things like that. And the reason my father stopped it is because the Brown family and the Martin family kept trying to get my father and mother to swing with them and have sex.
Mm-hmm.
About the seventh or eighth time, they asked my mother and father to swing with them.
Yeah.
Father got mad, and they were swinging with Betty White and her husband Murray, and the family next to me, a Baptist man by the name of Brainiac and his wife Joan. And they were all doing drugs together and having these swinger parties, and they wouldn't leave my mother and father alone. And my mother and father didn't do drugs, and they didn't swing. He got mad and he called the police and brought the police over to his car, and they opened the trunk and it was loaded with drugs.
Yeah.
And that was Mr. Brown living with Mrs. Martin. And then 4 days later, Kennedy was murdered. Stone illegally cut the bone out of my foot, run to the hospital. And when I was sitting in Oakland County in L. Brooks Patterson's office when they murdered 5 more of my kids in 2 states that I mentioned earlier,
Mm-hmm.
this gets confusing. Yeah, I lost my train of thought again. Well, while I was sitting in his office, I asked for a Freedom of Information request in Warren, Michigan Police Department for Stone being put in jail for 30 years for running a hospital and performing surgeries without any medical training. And that was when Trump was running and Stone was his campaign manager, and they denied my Freedom of Information request. And how they denied it is they said there's too many cases with the name Stone on it, and we can't find that particular case. So they denied me my Freedom of Information. But this was headlines in the Detroit News and Sterling Heights newspaper and Warren newspapers. And he was supposed to go to jail for 30 years. And then you put that together with Osbourne kidnapped me, tortured me, beat me across my thighs while I was on my knees with 2x4s while Daryl Hall watched and masturbated. And Daryl Hall is double jointed. He can perform oral sex on himself. And that's what he was doing as Osbourne and Long and Wallace tortured me on the day they cut my father's hands off, Mr. Pratt. And then the Twin Towers were built on Pratt Street. So I know all of this was planned back when I and my twin were kidnapped in 57. I don't think it, I know this.
Clearly.
Even my baby pictures were taken on 9/11/53 before the Twin Towers were built. And then they murdered Kennedy at the Trade Mart on his way to the Trade Mart on Stemhold Drive. And the Trade Mart in Texas was the Twin Towers of that day. That's where they did all the business. And so after they murdered Kennedy, they built the Twin Towers and they planned on blowing them up. And I can prove that in 100 different ways. But I go fast forward to Martin and Brown, my dad stopping their illegal gun and drug trade. And that's the same gun and drug trade sold to me by Donald Trump's tax attorney Mazzar. And never the drugs, they just go from one set of police to and drug dealers to another set of police and drug dealers in that area. That was Oakland. That was Macomb County, Michigan at that time. Sterling Township was Macomb County. And well, after my father did that, Hackle, a dog catcher, he put me in he tried to put me in a dog cage, told me he was going to arrest me and he wasn't even a cop. And then I took his gun from him, and he wasn't supposed to be carrying a gun, and he wasn't a policeman, he was a dog catcher. And he tried to arrest me at a party, and I was doing nothing wrong. I wasn't drinking, I wasn't doing drugs. And he tried to stuff me into a dog cage and arrest me. I slapped the shit out of him. And I told him, you're not going to arrest me and you're not going to put me in that drug cage. I've done nothing wrong. And then he got a call for a stray dog, and he had to go on the call. And as he pulled out of the driveway, he says, Squire, I'm going to get you one day. And then he got me one day. They murdered Judge Hunter Sterrett, Selfridge Air National Guard, kidnapped my daughter with a Kennedy child. And they were going to murder my daughter. They were going to bury her. They had her locked in an earth mover. And this was right after Jimmy Hoffa disappeared. And you've seen my court case. I hired Schwartz and Associates, and I had 100 corporate lawyers for that one case.
Mm-hmm.
And Sheriff Hackle, he became sheriff in Oakland County after being a dog catcher. And he covered up the murder of Judge Hunter Stair and the murder of a Dr. Brandenburg as they kidnapped my daughter. And Alex Jones gave you a photograph stolen from my family by Cook and Perry. The oil painting from Willie Gardner as they kidnapped my daughter. And Willie Gardner was a good friend of mine. He would come to Warren, Michigan, and we would sit down and talk for hours over a cup of coffee. And we did this dozens of times.
Okay.
And that was,
I didn't know that part.
That was the oil painting. Alex Jones said 9/11 was an inside job. And I went to kindergarten with the Jones family. And then the Jones family owns the newspaper where two of my wives were murdered. And then the publisher of that newspaper, Alex Jones owns, was raping little kids as they murdered my wives on the Manning Ranch. And Manning co-created the JFK archives. And this is how complicated my life really is. The police who came out to my house for 2 murders and over a dozen break-ins all used fake names and badge numbers. So I didn't even get legal police reports. And then they were caught dealing drugs, and all of them were put in jail. The entire police force in Greenville, Tennessee, 15 policemen were put in jail. And we've done videos about that. So Martin and Brown, my dad stopped their illegal gun and drug trade because they kept trying to get him and my mother to swing with them and the rest of the neighbors around them, Betty White and Mr. Brainiac. And
Betty White from the Golden Girls and Brainiacs, the Superman villain.
Well, her husband ran the Preakness, and the Preakness is in your book for a specific reason, having to do with the Twin Towers. And I'm not going to say what. But Brown was my mother's own family, and so was Martin. Peter Pan was my mother's family. Johnson was dating Madeline Duncan Brown at the time.
I knew you'd circle around to that sooner or later. I've been thinking about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
The very family that your dad stopped.
That was when Kennedy was murdered 4 days later, and there's my 4 again. My 4 again. It's in everything. I was kidnapped at 4. They murdered my identical twin at 4. And then Johnson, when he took office, he called my family's farm about 5 kids that were murdered, the Duncan kids, after Kennedy's murder. So all of this fits together with my baby pictures taken on 9/11, 1953 by Kodak, who tried to help Trump steal the White House.
Yeah.
With Osbourne and Stone, who kidnapped me and murdered my twin.
Right.
None of this is a lie. This is all truth, and you know that.
His tax lawyers sold you the property, and his attorney general, his bar that runs Grand Station. I mean,
my neighbor in Oakland County, and Graham Media ran all the media that covered up my twin's murder and my kidnap. And L. Brooks Patterson protected Osbourne and got $25 million a year until he died, and he never solved a single child killing. And when I was 17, I told his nephew, Ted Oglesby, whose mother is Mrs. Patterson, that his uncle was sitting outside the house I was raped and tortured in as they murdered my twin. That night, my friend Ted Oglesby was murdered in an Oakland County jail and hung in his belt. And I know damn well his uncle did that because he was collecting $25 million a year from taxpayer money via the federal government to solve the Oakland County child killings, and he never solved a single killing.
Yeah.
And they killed my cousin, Timmy King, and his family was President Ford. President Ford's real name was King and Gardner, and I'm the King and Gardner family. And they didn't, Graham media never said any of this. They completely covered this up with L. Brooks Patterson. And then Trump ran against Obama and Clinton and McCain and that governor where you live. What was his name? Kasich?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and then Trump ran, the people that ran Trump's campaign were all the people who kidnapped me and murdered my twin. Mm-hmm. And this is true. There's no lie in this. So after my father stopped Brown and Martin's drugs, Kennedy was murdered 4 days later. Then Johnson had been dating Madeline Duncan Brown, and you had a news reporter named Dorothy Kilgore, and Dorothy was my aunt, and she and her husband owned Hugh Street, and that's where Baker College was built. And on the day they murdered Kennedy, they closed down Fitzgerald High School and built Hazel Park High School in Oakland County, Michigan, as they murdered my twin and dozens of kids all around me. And then they murdered the 5 Duncan kids, and Mr. Duncan was a good friend of mine. Mr. Duncan and one of my uncles and my father, they captured a brown bear after killing its mothers on my family's farm in New Haven, Michigan. And they kept that bear until it died behind Duncan's bar in a cage. And everybody in my family used to play with that bear because my uncle and my dad and Mr. Duncan raised it from a cub. You got this picture? Mm-hmm. I grew up with a bear at the Duncan restaurant and bar. And I knew Mr. Duncan my whole life. The news that day, they said that Mr. Duncan kids all sat at the kitchen table and ate a box of rat poison. Biggest lie there ever was. The kids ranged in age from 1 to about 12. And tell me a kid that's going to sit around the box and he can read, and it says poison, who's going to sit there and eat a box of rat poison. And on that day, the world got Duncan McLeod. There could be only one. Remember that movie?
Yeah.
Then the public school system that the FBI funded in my life made reading Agatha Christie's Arsenic and Old Lace. And what does that mean? Arsenic and old lace. That means somebody poisoned the kids. They made that required reading in all the public schools. And the FBI was funding my school system when they did that.
That explains why on Friday the 13th, Jason's mother said they were friends with the Christies.
Yeah, and then I bought Miller a house. The real Agatha Christie is Miller. And I was running a factory next to Jack Ruby's Carousel. I and my partner rented from Jack Ruby's trademark, the Carousel. When I funded Miller's house. And I never told Miller I did that, but I grew up with the Miller family. I grew up with them. Now we're going to go from Trump and Kennedy's murder with the Duncan kids' murders. And this all occurred in New Haven, Michigan, where Jimmy Hoff is buried. And we'll get into that. But when I was in high school, I started playing drums in varsity chorus for John Kay of Steppenwolf. And the Vietnam War was going on. He had come to Michigan because he knew people there. And he played piano with me. And that was before Gary Shunk, who taught music at Michigan State all his life. And he just recently died. I played drums for John Kay of Steppenwolf. And back then he called himself Kane. And that tells me that as the WWF and DuPont stole my trademark from Warren, where Webster was funding my school system, DuPont stole my trademark with Claire Cummins. After we won the Battle of the Bands at 2 colleges and at that high school, where Mitch Ryder, my family in a roundabout way through a marriage, was writing the songs Elvis Presley sang. So I'm playing music with Steppenwolf from California as the Vietnam War is going on. And I only played with him for a week. And then he went back to California. And then Gary Shunk got the job of playing piano. And I played drums for Gary Shunk. Mr. Towers, my music teacher, see, it went from taking my baby pictures to being my music teacher. And then his sons became policemen. Mm. And it's interesting. In Warren, Michigan, with Sheriff Hackle, where they covered up the murder of Judge Hunter Stair and Dr. James Brandenburg as they were going to murder my daughter of 7. And there's no lie in any of it. This is my life. Mm-hmm. Del Towers set up a little thing. I and John Kay of Steppenwolf and Lambert, Doug Flutie, Mike Lawson, Karen Ashtenberg, and myself, we played at the Macca's Sly Fox. And this is before they murdered. This is a little. I was 14. They murdered Hoffa when I was 19. But the same Towers with Eastman, who took my baby pictures on 9/11, had me playing at the Sly Fox when I was 14 at a party there for the varsity chorus. Now, when we were done playing, the bus wasn't there, had to come pick us up. So while we were waiting for the bus, I walked across the street and I handed Weiner and Associates $300 and asked them to protect my trademark. Mm-hmm. He took the $300 and never protected my trademark. And then Webster, who funded my school system, put my trademark in his dictionary as they stole it out of the Library of Congress. And I even know who stole the trademark out of the Library of Congress. It was the janitor.
How do you know that?
Because he bragged about it. He did the same thing in Oakland, in Macomb County. He became janitors there, and when he had friends that had to pay child support, he'd sweep up at night, and then he'd go into the files, and he would steal the files from divorce cases, child support cases. And this same janitor worked at the Library of Congress. Hmm. And that's how I know that, Greg. And he was a military guy. So I walked across the street and I hired Weiner and Associates. And then the next thing I know is Weiner closed his office, moved to New York with Aberdeen, and he's exposing himself to minors, and he never protected my trademark. And then I'm going to share this screen. And this is what him and a guy, a Jewish man named Edelstein, did with my trademark. And you've seen this before, but I want to put this. See, and this is me, Hugh Squire, entire lawyers bar in California. Can you see this, Greg?
Yeah, sure can.
The entire lawyers bar in California steals my business license in New York federal court, as the WWF and Howard Stern stole my name worldwide. You got Huey Squire or Huey Lewis in the News from France, and Billy Squire from Germany. They took my name, Hugh Squire, as they stole my trademark, and the director of the FBI, Mr. Webster, as they stole the trademark, put it in his dictionary. And the FBI did this to me, Greg. Just like the FBI kidnapped me and murdered my twin. You got this picture? And there's no lie in this. This is how they kept me from suing Hollywood for all the movies. You know, I'm Hugh of Borg.
Yeah.
And I'm going to throw this little tidbit in. Renee Bennett, Harve Bennett's wife, Renee, she murdered John Benet Ramsey. And I don't think this, I know this. She pretended to be my mother's friend after she murdered John Benet. And John Benet is John Bennett, just like Tony Bennett. And the Bennett family made all the gas station pumps all over the whole world. The Bennett family did that. And this is back when you had, what was that guy? He made our dollar the petrodollar.
Nixon?
Huh?
Nixon?
No, his name starts with a K. I can't think of it now. People watching this, they'll know who I'm talking about. But he made it standard that all countries would pay $50 a barrel of oil. And his name started with a K. I can't remember it. It had, I think it had Kiss in his name, or
Kissinger? Kissinger?
Yeah, Kissinger. That was his name. So he made our dollar the petrodollar.
Okay.
Back when Osbourne and Webster, who funded my school system, my public school system, I also went to a Catholic school, and stole this is the entire lawyers bar of California, using my stolen trademark to pass the bar exam to become attorneys. And when I made my first video 55 years after they started doing this with Edelstein, Martin Edelstein in New York, where Weiner and Associates went, and he was exposing himself to minors. And that was Clinton's friend. And this was going on at the same time. My family members, Patterson, Sheriff Patterson, and Sheriff Perry, were delivering hookers to Bill Clinton. Remember this?
Mm-hmm.
And all of this happened at the same time. And then I fast forward 25 years, and the newspaper that covered up the murders of my wives in Tennessee, he was raping kids too. Now, this is a big pedophile network across the whole country.
Mm-hmm.
And they destroyed my life, murdered 4 of my wives, murdered my children, and murdered my mother's entire family, stealing money from us. And they're all gay pedophiles.
Mm-hmm.
You got this picture?
Yeah.
So as I became a publisher, my family's entire all my friends and my family, because I divorced Nancy and didn't tell them, I didn't tell anyone, not even the police, she tried to murder me. I didn't want her to go to jail. I left her the house I bought her. I left her the kids. I left her a brand new car, and I walked away in a pair of tennis shoes and shorts and a t-shirt and never went back. And they all judged me to be a bad person because I divorced a wife, cheating on me in front of my kids, who a year later tried to murder me.
And heck, you're only what, 16, 17 years old at the time?
Yeah, I was 17 at the most.
Yeah.
And then she was raping me. Nancy, she raped me when I was 14. That's why I married her. And she was in her 20s. She was 21 at least, maybe 22, older than me. She raped me in front of her mother's house. And then her mother comes to my mother's house and father's house and says I raped her daughter. I was 14.
Right.
And I didn't rape her daughter. I didn't even want sex. I kept pushing her away, but she wouldn't take no for an answer. And then she come back 2 months, 3 months later and told me she was pregnant and wanted money for an abortion. And I don't believe in abortions. I says, I'll marry you. I want my child to live. And my child lived. Then the Cook family married my first wife's brother, who ran part of Fort Knox, Mrs. Cook. And 3 hours after marrying my brother-in-law, she came to me for sex. And she was at least 7 years older than me, and I was still 15 at the time. And then Cook's family turns out to be my next wife's family, the Westhouse family. And she's 12 years older than me. And her mother would get naked and try to have sex with me. And her cousin Cook was trying to have sex with me after marrying my first wife's brother. And then she was 12 years older than me. And her whole family was raping me before I was an adult. You got this picture, Greg?
Yeah.
I'm going to stop this share and I'm going to come back to it. So I was playing at the Sly Fox with Towers, who was my chorus teacher at Warren High when I was 14. And that was like 4 years before they murdered Hoffa there. And then Towers took my baby pictures on 9/11, 1953 with Eastman. And
That's amazing. Yeah.
And Eastman lived next door to my farm, the Manning Civil War Ranch in Tennessee. And Eastman, along with the people who kidnapped me and murdered my twin, Osbourne and Stone, and some others, and I'm not going to say their names because it's too confusing. All these people kidnapped me at 4 and had gay sex with me after torturing me. As Daryl Hall, who owns a TV station in Pennsylvania, gave the world the Eagles. Joe Walsh. You got this?
Yeah.
And then as I became a publisher, I was talking and working with Ted Kennedy, Frank Sinatra, Elvis Presley's publisher, B.B. Bourne, Stan Mills. I was playing in a studio with Styx, you know, the rock group Styx. I actually was in the studio with them. I was working with Bob Seger's musicians. I was playing in the backyard of Bill Levice, Mitch Ryder and Detroit Wills with his band. My whole family steals my business, Bottomline, as I became a publisher. And my whole reason for applying to be a publisher in a federal court with Morton Gould and Kennedy and Sinatra and Elvis Presley's publisher was so I could publish my band, Bottomline.
Yeah. Yeah. They made a pretty big mistake there.
Oh,
While you're in the middle doing that, they steal it.
they all would have been millionaires. And my lead guitar player and lead singer, his dream was to take Elvis Presley's place. And here I am becoming a publisher in a federal court in New York with Elvis Presley's publisher. And she told me that Mr. Mills would give me a contract if I didn't become a publisher. And that tells me they had already planned 9/11.
Yeah, it does.
Years before it happened. Mills was taking the pictures of George Bush, and I'm the Mills family. You understand what I'm telling you?
Yeah.
Am I making this clear? So my mother and father, all my brothers and sisters, all my friends stole my business as I became a publisher. So I never published any of them.
Right.
I told them I'll publish you. They had me come back and play in the band again. And my little brother walked around telling everybody I was no good. And I'm the guy that taught him when he was 11 how to play a bass guitar. And I bought his bass guitar for him. You understand this?
Yeah, it's unbelievable the ways people think.
But I became a composer, a writer, and a publisher at ASCAP and BMI in New York with Elvis Presley's publisher, Stan Mills, Sinatra, Ted Kennedy, and Morton Gould, but I wasn't any good. And I had music in kindergarten through college. And the guy I taught to play guitar when he was 11 walked around telling everybody I wasn't any good.
And he played every instrument, didn't he? Just about all the stringed instruments.
Yeah, I play piano
and drums.
I play piano, guitar, and drums. I played drums in my band, and I named the band, and I made the band. You understand it? And then all of our contracts. My family owned the milk trucks, the patent for milk trucks. I worked for all the bar owners who drove milk trucks and then built bars.
Yeah. Used their money from the milk trucks to buy the bars, and then they employed your band.
When they stole my business, they were stealing from the people who built the bars, knew me when I was 4 years old, driving with them on milk trucks, and I was the little kid that would run up and put the milk in the milk chute or whatever they bought, you know.
Right.
Then you could buy bread or cheese or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
They all gave my band a job
because of you. And then the band members turned on you and kicked you out.
They didn't know it, Greg.
Yeah.
And when they did this, I was playing with Badfinger. Remember that rock group, Badfinger?
I was going to mention it, but I didn't want to.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was playing with them. I was playing with Styx. I was playing with Wayne Newton's musicians, Bobby J. He played saxophone through a synthesizer. I was playing with all these big name musicians in studios as they stole me my band and my trademark.
Yeah.
Almost to the day I became a publisher. And then they replaced me with Westfall, and then Westfall just screwed your wife over in Ohio, didn't they?
Yeah.
And then they replaced me a second time with a guy named Aaron, a drummer. And the drummers they replaced me with, they lost their contracts as soon as they replaced me. And Aaron is Elvis Presley. That's Elvis Presley's name, Aaron Elvis Presley. And his publisher, Born Publishing, was my friend in New York. We'd go out to dinner together. She would wear mink coats and we'd go to dinner together.
Yeah.
And my lead guitar player, the singer and lead guitar player, he always wanted to take Elvis' place. Well, Elvis was dead, and I'm sitting with his publisher, and they stole my business. I mean, how stupid is that?
Very, very short-sighted. Everything they had was because of you, and you were about to make them even crazy wealthy and famous, and they turned on you. It's unreal.
So now we're going to get into the Westhouse family. My second wife, that's Cook and Perry, her cousins. They own Apple. They run Apple right now.
Yeah.
They've stolen my life. They put on tombstones in cemeteries that my children with Nancy Fredericks, and that's Fredericks of Hollywood, are their children. And they've done this on gravestones, Greg.
Right.
Stealing my family's history. And then I'm related to presidents on U.S. money, and George Washington married into my family. And one of my murdered wives, her ancestor protected New York in 1776, Brigadier General Heath, for my family, Washington.
Mm-hmm.
So my second wife, they were raping me. I wasn't even an adult yet. And I think the legal age to marry in Michigan at that time was 21. And when the Vietnam War come along, they lowered it to 18, but I wasn't even 18. They were her mother and her cousins, who were all near 30. Her mother was in her 50s. They were all raping me.
Mm-hmm.
And then they started. Wow. A policeman by the name of Robbins pulled me over 3 times in my car. And I was working 2 jobs. I was driving truck in the morning for Morrison Carbonic out of Chicago. And this policeman, Mr. Robbins, he pulled me over 3 times, leaving my job at night playing drums. And he never gave me a ticket, never turned me in. He would just pull me over and he'd say, I want to look in the trunk of your car. And I'd go back there and I'd open the trunk of my car and it was filled with drugs. Mm-hmm. My second wife, related to Cook and Perry, was a drug dealer. And her and her brother, with Whitey, were selling drugs to the renegades and the outlaws. And they were doing it on her state policeman's farm. Her father was a state policeman.
Right.
You got this picture? And he always bragged to me about losing his job as a state policeman because he murdered an innocent guy. He bragged to me every time I saw him about that. Mm. That's not something you brag about, murdering an innocent guy.
Right.
So 3 times after Mr. Robbins pulled me over and showed me the drugs in my trunk, and my wife was using my car while I was at my first job because I had multiple vehicles. Some days I drive a motorcycle, some days a van, some days my car. On the days I didn't drive my car, her and her brother were loading it up with drugs from an airport. Mm. Got that picture?
Yeah.
And the police knew they were doing it, and the police were showing me.
I see.
They were showing me the drugs. And then I'd go home and I'd tell my wife, you got to stop dealing drugs, because I knew the police already knew they were doing it.
Right.
And they were doing it with all the bikers on her state policeman's father's farm.
Instead of taking a hint that you're trying to help them, they probably just got angry.
They tried to murder me 3 times.
Right.
2 of her cousins tried to murder me in front of Bob Seger's house in Union Lake, Michigan. And that's where she got the drugs from Park Davis. That was her first husband's brother. I don't remember his name, but his last name was Fedak, and they were all drug dealers. And he was stealing drugs from Park Davis, where they make pharmaceuticals.
Okay.
And she was ending up selling them with her brother to the Outlaws and Renegades, Hell's Angels, Hell's Our Home, on her father's property. With her ex-husband, and Oscar Tyler Moore. And you know Mary Tyler Moore.
Right.
And I remember I held the police off with a gun at my front door when I divorced Nancy, and decided to take the kids from her when she left my child there without his medicine, and he died in my arms. I decided at that point to take the kids, and I did it with a rifle at my front door. And the police from 3 cities came and sat outside my front door for a week. And while they sat there, they SWAT teamed Oscar Tyler Moore, who lived down the street from that house I built for my wife.
Okay.
On Isabel Street. And that's when Isabel Gardner Museum was robbed. And they changed the date, and they tell you it was robbed in 91. This is a big lie. It was robbed back in the 70s, Greg.
Okay.
They took Rembrandts and famous painters, and they've never gotten them back. And there's still a reward out for them.
Okay. Wow.
And that family introduced me to Whitey in the Outlaws a week before Hoffa disappeared. Whitey sold me a car, and her mother, who was taking all her clothes off and trying to have sex with me, who was in her 50s, was with Jimmy Hoffa at the Sly Fox. And she went to Warren High with Towers, just like I did, and she practiced witchcraft. But she didn't tell me she practiced witchcraft till I'd been married to her for a year. Then all of a sudden, she was a white witch and a good witch.
Yeah.
Selling drugs to bikers all over Detroit with Oscar Tyler Moore. As I played with Styx, I worked with Pink Floyd.
Yeah.
Badfinger played with me at night at Gene's club, and Gene was a milk truck driver, and I'm the only reason my band got that contract, and it was a good contract. We were making a couple of grand a week, playing 3 nights. And that's good money for 4 people back in the 60s.
Yeah.
And then as I became a publisher, they all stole my publishing company. And it was in 264 countries, Greg. It was a worldwide publishing company.
Sure.
And they stole it with Westfall. They replaced me with Westfall. And then he was dead in a week. He died in a plane crash. And Morrison, who I worked for, that was Jim Morrison in the Doors. He died in France. And then my competition, Leonard Skinner, died.
Yeah.
In a plane crash.
Just like Westfall. They all died saying, yeah.
Then my wife's mother told me about John Denver, and we went to a John Denver concert, and then John Denver died. And then I dedicated my first album I published to John Kennedy, and he died in a plane crash. And every time these plane crashes occurred, an airline mechanic would show up and wave at me out in the office where I played at Club Tarot. It was originally called Cupid's Den when I was 14.
He was making his point clear what he did.
Yeah, he would show up and wave and wink at me every time one of these people died.
I think that's why we had a plane wreck here in Marietta. As I was telling you, telling people your story.
I wouldn't doubt it at all. And he worked for Morrison. And Morrison was John Wayne, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But I didn't know what I was doing. My little brother and all his friends walked around Westfall. I didn't know what I was doing, but I was with all the bands on the radio. And we were being played on the radio when they stole my business. And all the
Right.
contracts came from milk truck drivers who I worked for when I was 3 and 4 and 5 years old. Very stupid.
That's an
Yeah,
understatement.
yeah, and my own mother and father helped them do it. My lead guitar player, his mother and father, they all helped them do it because I divorced a woman who tried to stab me with a knife. She did stab me with a knife, and she threw me down 2 flights of stairs.
Right. After she raped you to begin with to get you.
Right, right. And then I didn't tell anybody she tried to murder me because I didn't want her to go to jail. I left my kids with her. I gave her a new car and I walked away.
Right.
I figured she wanted to live with the detective, Mr. Akers. And
I
then,
mean, when you're 15 years old, this is perfectly logical. I mean, I get
yeah,
it, you know.
and when Akers died, Eminem took over his house. The trailer on 8 Mile and Outer Drive, that's
Yeah. Then called his album Eight
that
Mile. Yeah.
detective, yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. And that's where I was born. I was born at 8 Mile and Outer Drive. Holy,
And he's the white rapper. And didn't you invent a type of music that was sort of similar to rap
yeah,
before actually rap
yeah,
actually came out?
yeah,
And so you get the white rapper from 8 Mile
yeah.
right there where
My
Akers
band was
lived.
doing rap before anybody. That's correct, right? And then
It's makes a lot of sense.
that detective died, Eminem got his house. A white rapper in Detroit. And my whole life is like this, Greg.
Now, here in Belpre, I noticed we had a parade and a motorcycle gang I'd never seen from Detroit came by. It's called Justice. I looked it up and it says they're from Detroit. I was like, well, that's interesting.
Yeah, well, they want to give you justice for telling writing my story.
Hmm.
They don't want to know that they do drugs with state policemen. Um, Getting back to Whitey was introduced to me by Louise Westhouse and Mary Westhouse, my wife, her mother and her. And he was a friend of her first husband, George, in the Outlaws. He
Yeah.
sold me a car. When I drove the car away, the transmission fell out of it. So I junked it and bought another car. And then the state police pulled me over and told me I robbed a bank in the second car I bought. And I have 5 kids I had just adopted in that car.
Yeah.
They
Okay.
pulled me over on I-75 with the FBI.
Okay.
And then a week later, when Hoffa disappeared, they told me I murdered Jimmy Hoffa. I buried him in my car I bought from Whitey.
Mm.
Only none of this was ever in the news. And they used another guy to tell that story in books, but it had nothing to do with me. And Louise, who was with Hoffa, she had nothing to do with truck driving. She was a telephone operator after coming out of the Navy. Her husband, her ex-husband, married to a German girl from Berlin, Nina.
Hmm.
And you got Nina's 99 love balloons about the time I divorced Mary because they wouldn't stop selling drugs. And then they tried to murder me 3 times. They gave me pills, and 3 pills and any 2 pills in any combination are deadly.
Hmm.
And I found that out after I took 2 pills and went to Royal Oak Beaumont. And the doctor there, he says, this guy's killing you. He's giving you 3 types of pills, and any 2 are deadly in any combination. So I opened a murder case against that guy, who was a doctor. And the murder case disappeared.
Hmm.
And this guy was in charge of all the doctors in Southeast Michigan.
That's
Guy that
interesting.
tried to kill me. And I know my wife called around, and her mother and her state policeman father set me up with this guy who tried to kill me.
Oh, this is the Pasternak story.
Yeah. And then 2 weeks later, 2 of her cousins attempted to murder me in front of Bob Seeger's house. And then the day after Hoffa disappeared, and my horse disappeared at the same time, Bud Westhouse put a tracer on me at midnight. I went there to pick up my kids and my wife, and he was going to kill me.
Mm-hmm.
As I sat over the hole he had just filled in, and I know Jimmy Hoffa and my horse are in that hole because my horse disappeared that day too. And he had dug that hole the week before.
Mm-hmm.
He rented a crane, and his son, Willard Westhouse, who was selling drugs with my wife, dug the hole with the crane.
Yeah.
You got this picture?
Uh-huh.
And they stole my horse, Greg. I had just bought a horse, and I was paying Bud, I don't know, $450 a month to board my horse. When his 2 cousins from Louise tried to murder me in front of Bob Seeger's house in Michigan, in Union Lake, Michigan, I believe is the name of the town. The police didn't want to make out an accident report, and I had taken a tree down. I snapped the tree in half that was bigger than a telephone pole on a motorcycle, avoiding these 2 women talking to each other, blocking traffic around the Nest turn.
Okay.
So they had cars stopped in both lanes, and there's nowhere to go. There's trees on one side, trees on the other side, 2 12-foot ditches, Bob Seeger's house up on the hill, and they tried to murder me. The police didn't want to come out and file an accident report because they knew it was drug involved. And they knew I was supposed to be dead. These were the people selling drugs with my wife and her brother in the Outlaws with Whitey and the Renegades. And she was an Apache Indian. And then think about the Renegades. Renegades are Indians, correct?
Right.
And they would all meet. They would meet with Hell's Angels, the Penetrators, and all the bikers clubs on their state policeman father's farm, who always bragged about killing an innocent person. And he was starting to try to kill me. I went there to pick up my wife and my kids, and we weren't having any trouble. Other than I asked her 3 times to stop selling drugs. I had 2 kids, she had 3, and we were their only support. And
right.
In 1960 and 1970, the amount of drugs she had in the back of my car, I could have went to jail for life.
Yeah, for a lot less than what was in
And
there.
they didn't seem to care, Greg. So the third time I asked her to quit selling, and she didn't. I gave her the house for $1, bought myself another house, and moved out.
Yeah, so by the time you're like 18 or 19 or so, you've already given away
on my
2
wedding
houses.
day to that woman, I walked into an hour after we were married. I walked in on her kissing another guy and hugging him, looking like she wanted to have sex with him. And she's never stopped cheating on me. And on top of cheating on me with men, she was a lesbian also. And she practiced witchcraft, and she sold drugs.
Right.
And that family, after murdering Hoffa, have murdered my next 4 wives with bikers and police. And all of them, the police in Greenville, And I moved to Greenville because my oldest friend, Don Dool, he lied to me. He told me he was moving back to Tennessee, and he never did. He told me that
Okay.
two, maybe three times. He wrote me a letter about it. He's moving back to Tennessee. He never moved back to Tennessee. If I hadn't have gone to Tennessee looking for him, my wives wouldn't be murdered. And his friend are Roseanne Barr, the Graham family. They own the
Osbourne too?
Osbourne. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is my oldest friend. After I escaped Osbourne basement, I was put on his property, half a mile down the road, a quarter mile down on Hoover Street.
Mm-hmm.
The end house on Hoover Street in the opposite direction from the school. And Osbourne lived in the middle. Roseanne Barr was there with Kathy O'Brien, and Hoffa raised Chucky O'Brien, her brother.
Yeah.
Same family. And
Let me ask you, Hugh, do you want to make a part 2 to this? Because this one's an hour and a half long so far.
no, I can cover this.
Okay. I'm gonna have to hit the mute button though and step away for a minute. And I'll
I'll end it here, and we can do a part 2.
okay.
Just let me know when you want to do it. You know, all of my wives were murdered on holidays.
Mm-hmm.
Christmas, Halloween, my birthday, July 4th, always on a holiday. But the police don't try to solve these murders.
Right.
That should tell them they were murders.
Right.
It's just unbelievable.
Right. Yeah, they should quit trying to blame the victims and help the victims
And
instead.
two of them I found murdered. I gave them CPR, revived them,
Yeah, flew them to the hospital and they killed them again in the
and
hospital
killed
when you
them at
weren't
the
even there.
hospital while I was 100 miles away.
Right.
And then they tried to tell me I murdered the love of my life. Her family, I called her family, and I said, somebody just tried to kill your mother. They came into town. They wouldn't let me in the hospital. And she was doing better. They took her off of life support. She didn't die. So then they overdosed her.
Right.
You got this picture?
Yeah.
Her own daughter and her own sister. And she had just had a fist fight with her sister, but I couldn't come in the hospital.
Right.
And I'm the guy that found her dead, gave her CPR. But
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Yeah.
and then that's when all the police in Greenville who were stalking her, that's when they went to jail, right?
Mm-hmm.
We'll end it here. Bye.
Okay. We'll see you next time. We'll start part 2 soon.